In a quiet corner of Rhode Island, locals used to walk into a standard coffee shop and see a towering 7-foot giant standing behind the counter. He wore a simple green apron and a polite smile, looking like just another hard-working manager named Vin. But for those who knew the truth, the sight was absolutely shattering. This man wasn't just a service worker, he was a titan who once stood at the very pinnacle of global sports, a household name whose face was plastered on billboards across the country. According to investigative reports published in July 2015 by major national sports media outlets, this was the shocking new reality for Vin Baker. The roar of 30,000 fans had been replaced by the quiet hum of a suburban cafe, and the world was left wondering how it all went so wrong. The numbers hidden in the official files are enough to make your head spin. Based on official financial reports from the Basketball Association and public salary databases, Vin Baker had accumulated a staggering total career earnings of approximately $100 million. $100 million. Most people believe that kind of wealth makes you invincible, but here he was, grinding out a shift for an hourly wage that wouldn't have even covered the tips he used to leave at 5-star restaurants. How does an Olympic gold medalist go from owning sprawling mansions to counting cents at a cash register? The public looked at him and saw a tragic failure, but the documents suggest a much darker struggle that was kept hidden for years. It was a descent that happened in the shadows, away from the flashing cameras. To understand the true scale of this collapse, we have to look at the night everything changed, when this hero of the court first traded his future for a secret, liquid escape. In the early 90s, the scouts of the professional leagues were buzzing about a young man who seemed to have it all. Vin Baker was the ultimate good kid. He was the son of a strict, God-fearing pastor, raised in a household where discipline was the law and moral failings were not tolerated. There was a certain image he had to maintain, a heavy burden of expectation that he carried on his broad shoulders. According to his official biographical records, he completed his journey at the University of Hartford in 1993, leaving behind a legacy as one of the most promising talents the school had ever seen. On the surface, he was the perfect role model, the kind of athlete parents wanted their children to emulate. He didn't party, he didn't cause trouble, and he seemed focused entirely on the game. The industry took notice of this polished diamond. In the summer of 1993, the official draft protocols of the professional league confirmed that Vin Baker was selected as the number 8 overall pick. He was the chosen one, the savior of a franchise, stepping into a world of sudden, overwhelming fame and fortune. Everyone saw the dunks and the brilliant footwork, but no one saw the cracks forming in the foundation of his psyche. The transition from a strict, sheltered religious environment to the wild, unregulated world of professional sports is a shock that few can handle. He was a young man with millions in his pocket and a desperate need to please everyone, but he had no defense against the pressures of the spotlight. People close to the situation, as noted in various deep-dive sports profiles, began to wonder if the pastor's son persona was actually a cage. He was playing a part, and the pressure of being perfect was becoming unbearable. Little did the fans in Milwaukee know their new superstar was walking on a tightrope, and the first gust of wind was about to blow him into a darkness that no amount of prayer could fix. The early years in Milwaukee were nothing short of a fairy tale. Vin Baker didn't just play basketball, he dominated it with a grace that belied his massive frame. They called him the Baker, and he was serving up masterpieces on the court every single night. He became the face of the franchise, a beacon of hope for a city that craved a winner. The statistics from that era tell a story of absolute elite performance. According to the official archives of the professional league, during the 1996 to 1997 season, Vin Baker averaged an incredible 21.7 points per game. He was an unstoppable force, a scoring machine that could outmuscle defenders and outsmart coaches. He was rewarded with the ultimate validation of his peers and the public alike. Based on the formal rosters of the mid-90s, he was named a 4-time consecutive All-Star, cementing his status as one of the top players on the entire planet. But as the fame grew, so did the whispers. The lifestyle of a multimillionaire athlete is filled with temptations that are often hidden from the public eye. In the locker rooms and the private planes, a different story was starting to emerge. While the fans saw a hero, some of his teammates began to notice something unsettling. There were reports, later detailed in various sports documentaries and retrospective interviews, about a certain scent that would linger around the star player during early morning practices, the unmistakable, sharp aroma of expensive cognac. It wasn't just a celebratory drink anymore. It was becoming a necessity. He was performing at an all-star level while secretly battling a fog of intoxication that he hoped no one would notice. He was a man living a double life, maintaining a Hall of Fame career on the hardwood while his private world was slowly being drowned in a bottle. In the height of his glory, he felt untouchable, but a massive trade was on the horizon that would move him to a city where the rain never seemed to stop, and neither did his thirst. Behind the closed doors of executive offices, a deal was being brokered that would send shockwaves through the entire sporting world. In September 1997, the news broke that Vin Baker was being moved in a massive 3-team trade involving the Milwaukee Bucks and the Seattle Supersonics. According to archival news reports from that autumn, this wasn't just a regular player swap. It was a tectonic shift in the league's power structure. The fans in the rainy city of Seattle were ecstatic, believing they had finally found the missing piece to a championship puzzle. They greeted him like a conquering hero, but very few people knew that this move was the beginning of a long, dark winter for the star player. The financial stakes were almost impossible to comprehend for the average person. Based on reports from sports financial analysts of the era, Vin Baker signed a monstrous 7-year contract worth a staggering $86 million. In the late 90s, $86 million was an astronomical sum that placed a target on his back. Every missed shot and every sluggish sprint was now being weighed against that massive pile of cash. The pressure was immense, and the expectations of a championship-hungry city were weighing heavy on his soul. But as he settled into his new life in the Pacific Northwest, the local media began to notice something strange. He wasn't the same explosive athlete who had dominated in the Midwest. While the public saw a man who had everything, his inner circle was starting to worry about how he was handling the isolation of his new environment. He had arrived as a savior, but the rainy city was about to become the backdrop for a personal storm that no amount of money could stop. And just when the fans thought they knew what was wrong, a shocking physical transformation began to take place right before their eyes. When Vin Baker arrived in Seattle, he wasn't just joining a team. He was stepping into the massive shoes of a local legend named Shawn Kemp. The comparisons were immediate and brutal. The fans expected the same high-flying dunks and raw power, but what they saw instead was a man who seemed to be losing a battle with his own body. Reports from the team's medical staff and sports journalists at the time began to focus on a single, troubling number. According to various training camp records, Vin Baker's weight had ballooned to over 127 kilograms. This was far beyond his optimal playing weight, and it was clear to everyone watching from the stands that he was struggling to keep up with the pace of the professional game. The headlines were merciless, mocking his lack of conditioning and questioning his dedication to the sport. But there was a deeper, more sinister reason for this physical decline that the newspapers weren't reporting yet. According to later testimonies from those inside the locker room, the weight gain wasn't just about food. It was the physical manifestation of a hidden struggle that was slowly consuming his life. During the 1998 to 1999 season, which was famously shortened by a labor dispute, the cracks in his professional facade became impossible to hide. The baker's dozen was becoming a shadow of his former self, and while the coaches tried to design special diets and exercise programs for him, the true source of his problems was tucked away in his locker, hidden from the light. People began to ask, was this just a case of a rich athlete getting lazy? Or was there a much more dangerous secret lurking behind those tired eyes? The answer would eventually surface, but not before the league came to a complete standstill, leaving a lonely millionaire with far too much time on his hands. The year 1998 brought a sudden and eerie silence to the arenas of the professional league. A massive labor strike, known as the Lockout, shut down the season for a grueling 204 days. For most players, it was a time to rest or train privately, but for a man struggling with internal demons, those 204 days were a death trap of isolation. According to official league documents and historical archives, this was the longest work stoppage in the history of the sport up to that point. Without the structure of daily practices, the discipline of a coach, or the adrenaline of a cheering crowd, Vin Baker found himself trapped in a luxurious mansion with nothing but his thoughts and a very well-stocked bar. It was during this period of forced unemployment that the habit turned into a full-blown dependency. In his own memoirs and later candid interviews, the former All-Star admitted to a chilling routine that would have ended a normal person's life much sooner. He confessed that during the peak of his isolation, his daily intake had reached a full bottle of hard liquor every single day. One bottle of cognac, day after day, while the rest of the world waited for the basketball season to return. He was drowning his anxieties in a sea of expensive spirits, using his millions to fund a slow-motion catastrophe. By the time the labor dispute was settled and the players were called back to work, the man who stepped onto the court was a ghost of the athlete who had signed that $86 million contract. The league was back, but Vin Baker was still lost in the fog of that long, lonely lockout. And as he prepared for the first game of the new season, a terrifying question hung in the air. How long could he keep his secret from the world before his body finally gave out on national television? In the late summer of 2000, the eyes of the entire world were fixed on the shimmering harbor of Sydney, Australia. It was the time of the Olympic Games, the ultimate stage where legends are carved into the history books. Among the elite giants of the United States basketball team, standing tall with a jersey that read USA across his chest, was Vin Baker. To the millions of viewers watching the global broadcast, he looked like the picture of health and peak athletic performance. He was part of the legendary Dream Team of that era, a squad of multimillionaires expected to bring home nothing less than the top prize. According to the official archives of the International Olympic Committee, in September 2000, Vin Baker and his teammates achieved a perfect record of 8 wins and 0 losses. They were invincible on the court, a juggernaut that crushed every opponent in their path. But behind the scenes of the Olympic Village, a much more harrowing story was unfolding, one that the cameras never captured. While his teammates were celebrating their victories, Vin Baker was reportedly fighting a silent, internal war. Based on later accounts from those close to the team and investigative sports retrospectives, the star player was managing a severe dependency that required him to consume spirits just to feel normal before a game. He was standing on the highest podium in the world, a gold medal being placed around his neck, yet his mind was already drifting toward his next drink. It was a terrifying paradox. He was a national hero and an Olympic champion, but he was also a man who was rapidly losing his grip on reality. The gold medal was supposed to be the crowning achievement of his life, but it turned out to be the last bright light before he descended into a long, cold tunnel of shadow. The world cheered for the champion, but in the quiet of his hotel room, the hero was already beginning to fade away. And as he flew back to the United States, a massive financial deadline was approaching that would force his secrets into the harsh light of the public arena. By the time the 2001 to 2002 season rolled around, the whispers in the Pacific Northwest had grown into a deafening roar of suspicion. You couldn't hide a problem of that magnitude in a professional locker room forever, no matter how many millions were at stake. The teammates who once looked to Vin Baker for leadership were now looking at him with a mixture of pity and frustration. According to explosive interview materials from his superstar teammate, Gary Payton, the signs were impossible to ignore during those early morning practices. The air in the facility would often be thick with the sharp, unmistakable aroma of expensive cognac, a scent that shouldn't have been anywhere near a world-class athlete at 9 o'clock in the morning. The coaches and the front office were reportedly caught in a desperate bind, trying to protect their $86 million investment while watching their star player slowly fall apart. The tension finally reached a breaking point as the media began to sense blood in the water. In January 2002, the pressure became so intense that the local press began publishing articles questioning the health and personal conditioning of the big man. Based on the newspaper archives from that month, the team was forced to issue vague statements to cover up the true nature of the crisis. They spoke of flu-like symptoms and personal matters, but the fans in the stands knew something was wrong. They saw a man who was once a blur of speed and power, now moving like he was trapped in quicksand. The management of the Seattle franchise realized they had a ticking time bomb on their hands, and they needed to move him before the explosion destroyed the entire team. They began working the phones, looking for anyone willing to take a chance on a fading star with a heavy secret. And in the heat of that summer, a legendary franchise from the East Coast decided to make a move that would either save Vin Baker's life or provide the final blow to his career. In the city of Boston, sports are more than just a game. They are a religion, and the fans at the historic Fleet Center have no patience for excuses. In July 2002, the news broke that the Boston Celtics had acquired Vin Baker in a blockbuster trade that was supposed to be his fresh start. According to the official press releases from the Celtics organization at the time, the team believed they were getting a veteran who could provide the missing championship DNA to their young roster. At 31 years old, Vin Baker was at a crossroads. He was moving from the rainy streets of Seattle to the high-pressure environment of one of the most storied franchises in all of sports. The media in Boston greeted him with a mix of cautious optimism and intense scrutiny, wondering if the pastor's son could find his way back to the light in the shadows of the championship banners. But the reality of Boston was much harsher than he had imagined. He was no longer the undisputed star. He was a man under a microscope, and his new head coach, Jim O'Brien, was a legendary disciplinarian who didn't care about past all-star appearances. Based on internal team reports and later journalistic investigations into that era of the Celtics, the clash between the coach's strict rules and the players' secret habits was immediate and violent. The management had reportedly built morality clauses into his massive contract, creating a legal minefield that Vin Baker had to navigate every single day. He was living in a beautiful home in the suburbs, earning millions, but he was essentially a prisoner of his own reputation. The pressure to perform in front of the most demanding fans in the country was driving him deeper into his dangerous routine. It was a recipe for a disaster of epic proportions, and it only took a few months before a single late-night incident in a hotel room brought the lawyers and the league executives running to his door with a document that would change his life forever. In the world of the Boston Celtics, there was no room for the faint of heart, and certainly no room for secrets that smelled like a barroom floor. By the winter of 2003, the honeymoon period for Vin Baker in Massachusetts was officially over. He was locked in a psychological war with his head coach, Jim O'Brien, a man known for a military-style discipline that left no margin for error. The tension in the locker room was thick enough to cut with a knife. According to official team documents from the Boston Celtics organization, in February 2003, the franchise took the drastic step of issuing a formal suspension to their star player. It was a public humiliation that sent a clear message. No matter how much money you make, the rules apply to everyone. The financial implications of this confrontation were staggering even for a man of his wealth. Based on reports from sports legal experts at the time, Vin Baker was facing a potential loss of approximately $5 million in salary and bonuses due to these disciplinary violations. The coach had delivered a brutal ultimatum: either enter a professional recovery program and stay clean, or face a permanent exile from the legendary parquet floor. The media followed every move, capturing images of a man who looked increasingly haunted by his own choices. According to various sports investigative reports, the pastor's son felt cornered and betrayed by the very people who were supposed to support him. He was at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. But instead of choosing the path of healing or the path of quiet retirement, Vin Baker decided to fight back in a way that shocked the entire league. He chose a third path, a legal battle that would lead him directly into a high-stakes courtroom drama where his entire future was on the line. In the high-stakes business of professional basketball, a guaranteed contract is usually considered ironclad, a sacred promise of millions that cannot be broken. But in the case of Vin Baker, the Boston Celtics were about to attempt the impossible. They wanted out of their commitment, and they were willing to use every legal weapon in their arsenal to make it happen. According to official legal notices and league records, in February 2004, the Boston Celtics formally terminated the contract of Vin Baker. It was a move that sent shockwaves through the players' union and the front offices of every team in the country. Never before had such a massive deal been torn to shreds so publicly and so violently over personal conduct issues. The numbers involved in this legal divorce were enough to make anyone's head spin. Based on financial reports and court filings from that era, there was an estimated $35 million remaining on his contract that the club simply refused to pay. $35 million vanished into thin air as the lawyers argued over morality clauses and breach of duty. Vin Baker went from being a protected asset to a legal liability in the blink of an eye. The press described it as a total collapse of a professional identity. As the court proceedings dragged on, the star player found himself fighting for his reputation and his bank account simultaneously. But as he walked away from the courthouse, a new and even more terrifying reality began to set in. He was no longer just losing his job, he was losing the very foundation of his life. The millions were evaporating, and the people he thought were his friends were starting to look for the exit. He had lost his primary source of income, but the most expensive part of his journey was only just beginning, and his next stop would be a desperate tour of the league's basement. After the disaster in Boston, Vin Baker became a journeyman, a once great titan, reduced to a low-risk experiment for teams looking for a cheap veteran presence. He was no longer the centerpiece of a franchise. He was a name on a list of available players, a shadow of the man who had once dominated the All-Star game. His journey took him through some of the most famous cities in the world, but the magic was gone. According to the official archives of the professional league, during the 2004 to 2005 season, he managed to appear in only 17 games for the New York Knicks. The bright lights of Madison Square Garden only served to highlight how far he had fallen. He wasn't the Baker anymore, he was a cautionary tale in a jersey. The decline was visible in every single box score and every sluggish movement on the court. Based on statistical databases from those final years, his scoring average plummeted to a meager 7 points per game, a heartbreaking fraction of his former glory. He moved from New York to Houston and finally to the Los Angeles Clippers, but the results were always the same: missed practices, limited minutes, and a growing sense of irrelevance. Reports from sports journalists who covered those teams noted that he often sat at the end of the bench with a distant, glazed look in his eyes, as if he were watching a movie of someone else's life. By the time the 2005 to 2006 season came to a close, the phone stopped ringing. The league that had once handed him $100 million now acted like he didn't exist. He was left alone in a silent gym, far from the cheering crowds, with nothing but the echoes of his past and a very dangerous habit that was about to cost him every cent he had left. But the real tragedy wasn't just the end of his career. It was the sivta of people who were about to finish what the bottle had started. In the flashy world of high-stakes sports, success rarely travels alone. When Vin Baker was at the top of his game, he was surrounded by a massive sivta of people who were all too happy to help him spend his fortune. They were the friends from the old days, the distant cousins, and the hangers-on who suddenly appeared once the checks started getting larger. They followed him to the expensive dinners, flew on the private jets, and lived in the guest houses of his various properties. According to his own candid admissions in his later memoirs, Vin Baker was supporting approximately 15 to 20 people on his personal payroll during the peak of his career. These were individuals who didn't have jobs of their own. Their job was simply to be in the orbit of the superstar, keeping the party going and making sure his glass was never empty. The cost of maintaining this lifestyle was beyond what most people can even imagine. Based on bank statements and financial disclosures that surfaced during his later legal troubles, the monthly expenses for this inner circle reached tens of thousands of dollars. We are talking about luxury car leases, high-end clothing, and constant travel, all billed directly to the man who was supposed to be focusing on his jump shot. This wasn't just generosity, it was a slow-motion robbery disguised as loyalty. These people saw Vin Baker as an endless ATM, a golden goose that would never stop laying eggs. They ignored the signs of his physical decline and the smell of spirits on his breath because they knew that as long as he was functional enough to sign a check, their lifestyle was secure. But as the points on the scoreboard began to drop, so did the balance in his bank accounts. The friends who were there for the champagne started to look very nervous when the bill finally came due. And as the spotlight began to fade, Vin Baker realized that the people he had spent millions on were the first ones to vanish when the money ran dry. But the worst was yet to come, as he discovered that his biggest financial mistakes weren't just the people he fed, but the businesses he was talked into. How does a man lose $100 million? It sounds like an impossible task, but for Vin Baker, it became a tragic reality through a series of disastrous choices and guaranteed investment opportunities that turned out to be nothing more than black holes for his cash. He wasn't just spending money on luxury items, he was pouring it into failing restaurants, questionable real estate ventures, and business deals proposed by experts who had no idea what they were doing. According to civil court records and public legal filings, the year 2008 marked the beginning of a relentless wave of lawsuits from creditors who were no longer willing to wait for their money. The Baker empire was crumbling, and every morning brought a new legal notice or a process server at his door. The situation was even more dire behind the scenes with the government. While his advisors were busy losing his money in bad stocks, they were also failing to handle the most basic responsibilities of wealth. According to official notifications from the Internal Revenue Service and public tax documents, Vin Baker had accumulated a tax debt totaling several $million in unpaid obligations. He was being squeezed from both sides. The banks wanted their loans back, and the government wanted its share of the millions he had already spent. It was a financial pyramid of his own making, fueled by bad advice and a total lack of oversight. He had trusted people with his future, and they had led him into a maze of debt that had no exit. He was a man who once earned more in a single game than most people earn in a decade, yet he was now living on borrowed time and borrowed money. The walls were closing in, and the ultimate symbol of his success, his massive multi-million-dollar sanctuary, was the next thing on the chopping block. The dream team life was officially over, and the repossession agents were already warming up their engines. For years, the crown jewel of Vin Baker's lifestyle was his magnificent estate in the hills of Connecticut. It was a sprawling sanctuary that cost approximately $3 million, a place of marble floors, massive swimming pools, and every luxury a professional athlete could desire. To the outside world, that house was the proof that he had made it, a fortress that protected him from the pressures of the league. But by 2010, the fortress had become a cage. According to real estate registry data and foreclosure reports from the local courts, 2010 was the final year that Vin Baker could call that property his own. The bank had finally run out of patience, and the legal process of seizing the home was completed with clinical efficiency. The image of a former Olympic champion being forced out of his own home is one of the most haunting symbols of his collapse. He wasn't just losing a building, he was losing the last shred of his dignity and the physical evidence of his life's work. Based on court-ordered asset seizure reports, he watched as his furniture, his awards, and his personal belongings were cataloged like items in a grocery store. He was essentially homeless, moving into a state of total uncertainty with no clear path forward. The money was gone, the house was gone, and the phone had stopped ringing years ago. At this point, the only thing he had left was a deep, dark dependency that promised to take the one thing the banks couldn't: his very life. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a void of despair, and many of his former fans wondered if they would ever see him again. The Baker was broken, and as he walked away from that $3 million mansion for the last time, he was entering the darkest period of his existence, a place where the only voices he heard were the ones in his head. By the time 2011 arrived, the man who had once been the toast of Milwaukee and Seattle was living in a terrifying personal purgatory. The money was a distant memory, replaced by a crushing weight of debt and a physical condition that was rapidly deteriorating. According to his own later accounts and various documentary projects, 2011 was the year he reached what he calls his point of no return. He was no longer just drinking to feel good, he was drinking to survive the day, trapped in a cycle of tremors and mental fog that clouded his every waking moment. The star who once commanded the respect of millions was now alone in a quiet room, struggling with hallucinations and a sense of total despair that threatened to finish his journey once and for all. In the medical chronicles and clinical reports from that era, it was noted that the former athlete had already attempted to find a way out through professional help multiple times. Based on those records, Vin Baker had gone through 4 separate courses of intensive rehabilitation before this final collapse, and each time the results had been the same: a temporary period of sobriety followed by a deeper, more violent return to his old habits. He was a man whose body was essentially giving out, his organs struggling to process the massive amounts of toxins he was consuming daily. The doctors had been very clear: if he didn't stop now, his heart would simply not hold out much longer. He was staring at the literal end of his life, a lonely and tragic conclusion for an Olympic champion. But just as the shadows seemed to be closing in for good, a voice from his past reached out through the silence. In the middle of his darkest hour, a phone call came from a man who didn't want a piece of his fortune, but wanted to offer him a reason to live. In the world of high finance and professional sports, Howard Schultz is known as a titan of industry, the man who turned a small coffee chain into a global empire. But to Vin Baker, he was something more: a former boss and a man who had seen him at his best. As the former owner of the Seattle franchise, Schultz had watched Vin's decline from a front-row seat, and he wasn't willing to let the story end in a tragedy. In various business journals and interviews conducted around 2015, Howard Schultz discussed the motivations behind his decision to reach out to his former star. He saw a man who was lost, not a player who had failed, and he decided to extend a hand that wasn't tied to a basketball court. The offer was something no one expected. It wasn't a loan or a handout. It was a chance at a completely different kind of career. According to official corporate data and employee training records from the Starbucks organization, Vin Baker was invited to enter a rigorous management training program. This wasn't a celebrity endorsement deal where he could just show up and smile for the cameras. Based on the terms of the agreement, he had to start from the very bottom, learning every aspect of the business as if he were a 20-year-old student. For a man who had once been the king of the arena, the idea of wearing a green apron and serving customers was a massive blow to his ego. But Schultz knew that what Vin needed wasn't more money. He needed a purpose and a structured environment where he could rebuild his sense of self. It was a humiliating proposition for an all-star, but it was also the only lifeline he had left. Before he could return to the world of the living, he had to face the ultimate test of his humility, and it started with a 5 o'clock wake-up call that would change everything. The image of a 6-foot, 11-inch giant standing behind a tiny cash register is something that sounds like a comedy sketch, but for Vin Baker, it was the start of a grueling second act. In a quiet suburb in Rhode Island, the man who had signed a contract for $86 million began showing up for work long before the sun came up. According to reports from local media outlets that eventually broke the story, Vin Baker's shifts often began at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning. He was responsible for grinding beans, cleaning counters, and interacting with commuters who had no idea they were being served by an Olympic gold medalist. He was no longer the center of attention. He was a worker among workers, earning an hourly wage that was a universe away from his former salary. Based on market data and corporate pay scales from that period, a manager trainee in that position would have been earning approximately $15 an hour. For most people, that is a respectable living, but for a man who had once blown through millions in a single month, it was a staggering lesson in the value of a dollar. The transition was not easy. There were days when customers would recognize him, their countenances showing a mix of shock and pity as they realized who was taking their order. But instead of hiding in the back, Vin chose to lean into the work. He used those moments to practice a new kind of discipline, one that didn't involve a ball or a hoop. The green apron became his new uniform, a symbol of a man who was finally willing to be honest with himself about his failings. He was learning how to live a normal life for the first time since his teenage years, and the results were starting to show in his clear eyes and steady hands. He had found a way to be sober, but he was also finding a way to be useful again. Yet, as he perfected his skills in the coffee business, a new ambition began to stir in his mind. He had cleaned up his own life, but now he wanted to return to the one place that had nearly destroyed him. The road to redemption is never a straight line, and for a man who had fallen from the heights of a $100 million career, every step forward was a battle against the gravity of his own past. But as the seasons changed and the green apron became a symbol of his new life, a miracle began to take place in the quiet corners of his mind. According to his own public statements and the testimony of those who stood by him, April 2011 marked the official start of a completely new calendar for Vin Baker. It was the day he finally put down the bottle for good, committing himself to a life of absolute clarity. This wasn't just about quitting a habit. It was about a total spiritual overhaul, a return to the values that his father, the strict pastor from his youth, had tried to instill in him decades earlier. The transformation was so profound that it led him back to the very place he had once tried to escape: the church. Based on official records from the religious communities in Connecticut, Vin Baker eventually took on a new and heavy responsibility, following in the footsteps of his father by becoming an ordained pastor himself. He was no longer leading a fast break on a basketball court. He was leading a congregation through the challenges of life, using his own story of ruin as a cautionary tale for anyone willing to listen. He had found a way to be a leader again, but this time the stakes were much higher than a championship trophy. According to those who attended his early sermons, there was a raw, unfiltered honesty in his voice that moved people to tears. He had survived a storm that had swallowed other men whole, and he had come out the other side with a clarity he hadn't possessed since he was a teenager. He was 10 years sober, a milestone that felt more significant than any all-star selection. But as he stood behind the pulpit, a new ambition began to burn in his chest. He had cleared his mind and cleaned his spirit, and now he felt ready to face the world that had once watched him crumble with such morbid curiosity. He was ready to go back to where it all began, and a phone call from a familiar area code was about to change his life for a third time. In the world of professional sports, memories are often short, and the public is usually quick to discard a star once the highlights stop rolling. But the city of Milwaukee had a long memory, and the people inside the Bucks organization hadn't forgotten the man who had once been their Baker. In January 2018, a piece of news broke that felt like a glitch in the matrix to those who had followed his tragic fall. According to a formal press release from the Milwaukee Bucks, Vin Baker was officially returning to the team, but not as a player. He was named as a key member of the coaching staff, an assistant tasked with developing the next generation of talent. It was a move that felt like the closing of a massive, painful circle. The challenge of returning to a professional locker room after years of being a social pariah was immense. He was walking back into the same environments where his secret dependency had once taken root. But this time, he wasn't there to hide. He was there to serve as a mentor and a guardian. Based on numerous interviews with the team's modern-day superstars, Vin Baker's role became much more than just technical training. He became a vital influence on the development of the legendary Giannis Antetokounmpo, the young giant known as the Greek Freak. According to accounts from the training facility, Baker would spend hours with the young star, not just working on his footwork, but sharing the hard-earned wisdom of a man who had seen the dark side of fame. He was teaching these young millionaires how to navigate the very traps that had once caught him. He was a survivor among the elite, a man who could look a young player in the eye and tell them exactly what $100 million feels like when it's slipping through your fingers. He was back in the league, respected and sober, and the team was on the verge of something historic. But as they fought their way through the playoffs, Vin Baker realized that destiny had one more surprise in store for him, a moment of ultimate justice that would happen exactly 20 years after his last great success. For a man who had lost almost everything, the idea of a championship ring was a dream that felt like it belonged to a different person from a different life. But in the summer of 2021, the city of Milwaukee was on fire with the kind of excitement that only happens once in a lifetime. The Bucks were in the finals, and standing on the sidelines, dressed in a sharp suit instead of a jersey, was Vin Baker. According to the official statistical records of the league, in July 2021, the Milwaukee Bucks secured their victory in the championship finals, ending a drought that had lasted for exactly 50 years. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy that sent the city into a frenzy. But for Vin Baker, it was something much deeper than just a sports victory. When the final buzzer sounded and the confetti began to fall from the rafters, the cameras captured a man who looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was an NBA champion at last, receiving a massive diamond-encrusted ring that symbolized his contribution to the team's success. Based on historical data from the franchise, this was the first time the team had reached this pinnacle since the early 70s, and Vin Baker was a part of the reason why. To the public, it was a nice story of a former player getting a second chance, but to Vin, it was a form of spiritual restitution. He held that ring in his hand and realized it was worth more than all the millions he had spent in the bars and the nightclubs of his past. It was a physical proof that he had not just survived, but he had thrived. He had gone from $100 million to $15 an hour, and then all the way back to the top of the mountain. The world had seen him at his worst, and now they were seeing him at his absolute best. Yet, even with the championship ring on his finger, there was one final piece of his past that he needed to address. A mission that went far beyond the boundaries of a basketball court and involved the many young men who were currently walking the same dangerous path he once did. Having walked through the fire and come out on the other side, the former All-Star realized that his most important work was not happening on the basketball court, but in the quiet rooms where the next generation of millionaires was being groomed. He became a man with a mission, a living shield for young athletes who were suddenly thrust into a world of unimaginable wealth and toxic temptations. According to official reports from the Professional League's Department of Player Development, Vin Baker became a cornerstone of the annual Rookie Transition Program. Every year, he stands before a room full of 20-year-olds who think they are invincible, and he tells them the cold, hard truth about what happens when the cheering stops. He doesn't lecture them from a place of superiority. He speaks as a man who lost $100 million and almost lost his life to a silent, liquid enemy. The scope of his influence in this role is documented in the annual reports of the Player Association, which highlight his participation in dozens of seminars and one-on-one mentoring sessions. He often shares the story of a specific, high-stakes meeting in a hotel room in 2004, where the lawyers told him his career was effectively over. By using these documentary bits from his own past, he creates a reality check for young men who are currently being circled by the same vultures and parasites that once drained his bank accounts. Based on interviews with league executives, his presence has become a vital part of the league's efforts to prevent the kind of financial and personal collapse that defined his middle years. But while he was saving others, the question remained about his own financial recovery. Did the man who once earned $100 million ever manage to claw back even a fraction of that lost fortune, or is he destined to live a modest life forever? The answer lies in a series of surprising financial moves and a heartbreaking sacrifice that proved how much his priorities had changed. When people look at a man who earned over $100 million during his career, they find it impossible to believe that he could ever be worried about a utility bill. But for Vin Baker, the reality of his post-playing days was a stark lesson in the consequences of unchecked spending and poor oversight. To truly understand the scale of his financial reset, one must look at the physical items he was forced to part with just to keep his head above water. According to reports from major sports auction houses, in June 2014, Vin Baker made the agonizing decision to sell his 2000 Olympic gold medal. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was the ultimate symbol of his athletic peak. Based on the official auction results, that medal was sold for approximately $32,000, a tiny fraction of the millions he once threw away on luxury cars and expensive dinners. Today, his financial situation is a world away from the excess of the 90s, but it is far more stable than it was during his time behind the coffee counter. Based on sports industry salary surveys and coaching contract data, a top-tier assistant coach in the professional league can expect to earn between $500,000 and $1 million per year. While this is a king's ransom for most people, for a man who used to earn $15 million a season, it is a lesson in living within one's means. According to financial analysts who have followed his journey, Vin Baker now lives a life defined by strict budgeting and a total lack of the sivta that once surrounded him. He has reportedly spent the last decade working with financial advisors to settle his remaining debts with the tax authorities, a process that was documented in various public legal filings throughout the late 20-teens. He isn't a $100 millionaire anymore, but he is a man who can sleep at night knowing his bills are paid and his integrity is intact. But as he looks toward the future in 2026, there is one role that matters more to him than coach or pastor, and it is the one that keeps him grounded in his new, sober reality. As we look at Vin Baker in the current year of 2026, we see a man who has successfully navigated the most treacherous waters a person can face. He is no longer defined by the scandals of his past or the weight of his lost millions. Instead, he is viewed as a respected elder of the sport, a man whose presence in the Milwaukee organization brings a sense of gravity and wisdom to the locker room. According to his most recent biographical updates and public profiles, his primary focus outside of the arena is his family. He is the father of 5 children, and those close to him say that his greatest achievement is being a present and reliable parent, something that was impossible during the dark years of his dependency. The most important statistic in his life today isn't a points per game average or a shooting percentage. Based on his own public celebrations and social media milestones, as of 2026, Vin Baker has achieved over 15 years of continuous, total sobriety. This is a feat that many experts thought was impossible when he was at his absolute bottom in 2011. In his most recent interviews for major sports publications, he describes himself not as a victim of his circumstances, but as a man who was given a rare second chance to get things right. He is a fixture at community events, often seen speaking to youth groups about the importance of mental health and the dangers of the fast life. He has become a living testament to the idea that a person's history does not have to be their final destination. But as his story reaches its conclusion, there remains one final surprising detail about his life today. A secret act of kindness that was only recently revealed, proving that the Baker has finally found a way to give back more than he ever took. As we reach the final minutes of this incredible investigation, we have to look past the box scores and the bank statements to see the true measure of the man. The story of Vin Baker is not just a tragedy about $100 million that vanished into thin air. It is a blueprint for anyone who has ever felt like they were at the end of their rope. We are looking at a journey that spanned exactly 13 seasons in the professional league, according to the official historical archives of the sport. 13 seasons of elite performance, followed by a decline that was as public as it was painful. For a long time, the world only remembered him as the guy who lost it all. But if you look at the records from the last decade, you will see a different set of numbers that define his legacy far more than his points per game ever could. Based on his public advocacy work and certified health milestones, as of 2026, Vin Baker has maintained more than 15 years of total uninterrupted sobriety. This is the statistic that matters most to the people who actually know him. It is a victory that required more heart and more grit than any game-winning shot he ever took in Milwaukee or Seattle. He has successfully transitioned from a cautionary tale into a pillar of his community, serving as a beacon for those lost in the same fog he once inhabited. According to various sports media retrospectives, he remains one of the few individuals to have experienced both the absolute peak of global fame and the humbling reality of an hourly wage, and to have come out the other side with his integrity intact. He didn't just survive his mistakes, he used them to build a better version of himself. But there is one final surprising detail that has only recently begun to circulate in the inner circles of the league. It is reported that in the late 20-teens, when a younger player was facing a similar financial and personal crisis, an anonymous mentor stepped in to cover the costs of a top-tier rehabilitation program. Based on later testimonies from those involved in the situation, that mentor was none other than Vin Baker. He did it quietly, without the cameras or the press releases, because he knew exactly what it felt like to be alone in that darkness. He has spent the last chapter of his life paying back a debt that can't be measured in currency. As the lights go down on his story, we are left with a powerful question. If a man can lose $100 million and still call himself a winner, what is the true price of a second chance? Perhaps the real secret of Vin Baker is that he finally found the one thing money could never buy. A reason to be proud of the man he sees in the mirror every single morning.